may have the courage to look up.
We've had triumphs, made some mistakes.
We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, and for this end to practice tolerance and live together in peace and security, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims.
In 1945, with these goals in mind, countries that emerged victorious from World War II formed the United Nations. Headquartered in New York, the main goal for the international organization was peace. Its charter, now observed by 185 UN member nations, is the closest thing we have to a global constitution.
The basic goal of the United Nations, as spelled out in the Charter itself, is maintenance of peace and security, but also on the basis of welfare for all peoples.
Remember that the UN is involved in much more than peacekeeping. It is working in the areas of disarmament and development and democratization, that's for free and fair elections and democratic governments. It works in the area of health and humanitarian efforts and refugee support.
There are 800 million people in the world that are malnourished and hungry. We reach 45 million of those people.
It is deeply involved in efforts toward human rights around the world.
The Commission on Human Rights is the most important body at the United Nations, the best known body, political body, dealing with human rights. The people now increasingly know that they have human rights. They increasingly know that there are international mechanisms that they can tap if they don't find their solution at home.
This is the only universal organization that exists, and most countries on Earth have great respect for what it does.
The two most prominent UN bodies are the General Assembly and the Security Council.
Despite all the wasted lives and hopes that war produces.
In the General Assembly, each country votes on recommendations that carry the weight of world opinion, though the UN has no power to require individual nations to act.
Progress in weapons technology.
The smaller Security Council has the primary responsibility for maintaining world peace and security.
It is right that the Security Council should meet so that we...
Its 15 members have the authority to deploy peacekeeping forces, impose economic sanctions, and order military action. Perhaps the most powerful countries on the Security Council are the 5 permanent members: China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Any permanent member can cast a negative vote and prevent the Security Council from acting.
We have taken political, economic, and military measures to quarantine...
The United States is regarded by many as first among equals at the United Nations. Because of its greater wealth, the U.S. agrees to contribute some 25% of the organization's regular budget. That sizable payment gives the United States clout, but it can also create conflict.
The U.S. has not paid its dues in many, many years. They have accrued over a decade to the point that the United States now owes over $1 billion. This, I should add, is a legal obligation. This is a treaty obligation, and it is a very serious issue that undermines the moral authority and the power of persuasion and the role model that has historically been set by the United States in this organization.
The world's biggest superpower is the world's biggest deadbeat, and that's not right. That's not right.
UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and the President pleading with Congress today to pay America's debt to the UN.
We have got to pay our UN dues and fulfill our responsibilities.
And I know you will be getting on to your congressmen and senators.
While poor countries like Pakistan and Fiji give the UN interest-free loans to cover America's debt, The U.S. owes 79% of the outstanding debt on the UN's regular budget, and 60% of the debt for UN peacekeeping operations around the world.
It's hurting our credibility. It's hurting our standing here. We should pay our bills because the UN is helping the United States.
But critics say Annan hurt his own case with Congress by praising Saddam Hussein and criticizing UN inspectors. And another big obstacle to getting the dues paid. Despite Annan's lobbying, Republicans say they won't pay until the UN stops supporting family planning, abortion in third world countries.
More than a half-century after its founding, debate over funding and power sharing are just two issues facing the United Nations. The Cold War is over. New alliances have evolved. Technology has changed the way we fight wars and negotiate the peace. The UN and its members are also making changes, struggling to redefine their roles and the ways in which they can best meet their international objectives.
We're concerned about our national security, to be sure, but we are also concerned about many other people's security and peace and prosperity and freedom.
Especially now that the Cold War is over, the UN has become a valuable contributor to goals that matter to Americans.
And for this end, to practice tolerance and live together in peace and security, and to ensure that armed force shall not be used, save in the common interest, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims, and do hereby establish an international organization to be known as the United Nations.
In 1992, when televisions flickered with images of starving children, the United States agreed to lead a UN peacekeeping mission to Somalia. The goal was to quash gang violence that filled the streets and distribute food to those cut off by the chaos. But a year later, the television images changed. Somali gang members captured a U.S. soldier and dragged him through the streets. Citizens at home saw the incident on television and recoiled. The United States briefly reinforced its presence, then left. Many people believe the technology of television, the heart-rending pictures of starving people, then the torturing of a soldier, played a role in the United States' involvement and withdrawal from peacekeeping efforts in Somalia. Rival factions resumed their war once troops were gone.
We started out okay with the initial U.S.-led intervention, but then there was a lot of changes that I would mention that led to the collapse and the failure of that mission. We had started out with a very experienced oversight of key Americans who knew the region well. And right in the middle of the operation, we changed the management of it on the ground. We changed horses, and it became a UN operation, UN-led instead of US-led. We reduced the effective combat capabilities that were in that force at the very time that we were expanding the UN mandate. It was more ambitious than the initial one. We kind of personalized the adversarial situation in Somalia between different factions and began going after one of the factions, in the process setting ourselves up as a target of that faction.
I'm a soldier, I have to do what I'm told.
And when it blew up in our faces in October of '93, the administration found it almost impossible to explain what we were doing there and why we should stay, and the whole thing just fell apart.
The following year, the United States launched another peacekeeping effort, this time to Haiti. In 1991, the elected president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, had been overthrown by a military coup. In September of 1994, the Clinton administration was determined to restore Haiti to constitutional rule.
President Clinton, to his credit, received an endorsement from the United Nations. UN Security Council Resolution 1040 in effect said that each of the members of the United Nations could credibly threaten force in order and use force if necessary to implement UN Security Council resolutions, including those calling for the restoration of President Aristide.
But before launching troops, President Clinton called on former President Jimmy Carter, along with General Colin Powell and Senator Sam Nunn, to make a final effort at negotiating a peaceful transition.
President Bill Clinton asked President Carter whether he would be willing to lead a delegation to negotiate directly with the Haitian military to restore constitutional government and to leave office. That was the most exciting and sensational negotiation that I have ever witnessed. We were under very tight pressure. We arrived at Saturday at about noon, and we were told to get the military out of power and permit the restoration of President Aristide within 24 hours and get out. We didn't know at the time that President Clinton had already made a decision to begin a military invasion of that country, and by noon on Sunday, when we were supposed to depart, it was already well underway. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, as we were close to reaching complete agreement, the Haitian general broke into our meeting room and said that he had intelligence indicating that U.S. soldiers were getting parachutes at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, to parachute into Haiti. And that as far as he was concerned, we had betrayed the confidence of the negotiations, and that the talks were finished, and that he was taking his Commander-in-Chief, Raul Cedras, out of the room to begin to prepare for the defense of Haiti.
President Carter continued to negotiate even after U.S. invasion forces were en route to Haiti.
He pulled out General Cedras out of the meeting and brought him to the presidential palace and asked if I would stay to complete typing up the agreement. I had my little portable laptop. So he left me with these generals who were cleaning their guns, preparing for an imminent war, while I tried to finish typing the agreement. I said, guys, do you mind just trying to keep it down? I'm trying to finish this agreement. So it was a awkward and strange moment, but in the end, the talks succeeded.
The establishment of peacekeepers in Haiti succeeded at least in part due to the skill of the mediators chosen by President Clinton.
They made clear that there was a credible threat of force, but they didn't brandish it in front of the Haitian military. They left it on the table and they proceeded to negotiate in a different spirit with the Haitians. And that spirit permitted the Haitians to save some face and to negotiate an agreement that all sides would agree to. And U.S. troops were allowed in the very next day without one loss of life by a single individual, whether Haitian or American.
This is a very different and a much better day than it would have been had we not been able to successfully combine the credible threat of force with diplomacy. I want to thank President Carter, General Powell, and Senator Nunn again for their mission to Haiti and for their work in securing an agreement that will permit the peaceful departure of the military leaders.
It brings the restoration of democracy in Haiti much closer. It provides the opportunity for a long-term solution to the migration problems. From my own standpoint, it really is a classic case of power being used in the service of diplomacy, American power in the service of American diplomacy.
Welcome, President Clinton.
The threat and the use of force by the United States was legitimated by the UN Security Council. And that was very important because it said and put on record for the first time that the United Nations believed that the restoration of democratic constitutional government was a universal right that the UN supported.
In both Somalia and Haiti, the use of troops to monitor violence was only part of the UN's efforts. Long before peacekeepers were deployed in Somalia, the United Nations worked with non-governmental organizations to distribute food and attempt to restore peace. In Haiti, the United Nations and the Carter Center spent 4 years trying to negotiate the ouster of military dictator Raul Cedras. It appointed a special negotiator and held talks with General Cedras. It passed oil, arms, and trade embargoes, hoping the use of troops would not be necessary. But increasingly, troops are being used. Are the UN missions an appropriate use of U.S. military troops?
Well, certainly since the end of the Cold War, when there is cooperation among the UN Security Council permanent members, it is far more desirable for the United States to intervene or to get directly involved in the context of the United Nations. We share the responsibility with other countries. Our actions have greater legitimacy when they are underscored and a reflection of a commitment by the entire United Nations operation.
We need to husband our resources. We have some very special, unique advantages in terms of our status as a global superpower. And we cannot have our resources, which are large, but they are also finite, used in every single case. Some of our unique resources, for example, are things like airlift and intelligence and command and control. Perhaps we can do more if we kind of focus those unique resources that other countries do not have as part of our contribution, rather than trying to be involved with essentially ground forces in every case.
The United States has never, ever contributed more than 5% of troops at any given time. More than 50 other countries contribute more troops than we do, including the United Kingdom and Canada and Argentina and Pakistan and Fiji and Ghana. They consider it a service of honor and a privilege to do so.
Peacekeeping is about burden sharing. It's about bang for the buck. And while we do carry a significant responsibility, both in terms of dollars and in terms of forces, we are carrying a lot of other people with us when we do that, and getting jobs done that otherwise would either not get done at all or would be done very poorly. So it's an investment.
A haze has settled over this city of 18 million people. Government officials in Mexico tonight blame the miserable conditions on hundreds of grass fires set by farmers attempting to clear land in Chiapas, Tabasco, and near Cuernavaca.
When forest fires raged out of control in Mexico and Central America, the consequences were felt hundreds of miles away in the United States. The thick smoke that drifted north across the Gulf of Mexico caused pollution and health concerns.
Governor Bush is urging Texans to limit their physical exercise this weekend as the smoke and the haze problem puts the entire state under a health alert.
You can hear the gallery just hacking it up out there, just because it's so smoky out there.
Besides the worst drought in 70 years, part of the problem which caused the fires was economic. In Mexico, farmers had been clearing fields for planting by using the cheapest method they knew, burning. When the flames raged out of control, the United States government joined its Mexican neighbors who lacked enough equipment to quell the fires.
Their problems are our problems. Like I said, the smoke that's impacting them now is impacting us.
The fires illustrated why former Secretary of State Warren Christopher had insisted the environment, like military readiness, should be a foreign policy priority.
Environmental forces transcend borders and oceans to threaten directly the health, prosperity, and jobs of American citizens. That's why we're so determined to put environmental issues where they belong in the mainstream of American foreign policy.
But in the midst of the United States' promotion of its green agenda overseas, it was reaping criticism for environmental policy at home, especially on the contentious issue of global warming. At the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, the United States pledged to reduce greenhouse emissions to 1990 levels by the turn of the century. But 5 years after the Rio Summit, U.S. greenhouse emissions had actually gone up, not down.
If the treaty is ratified, people will certainly think differently about energy use, and they'll certainly have to become more miserly in their use of energy and look to alternatives. Unfortunately, that can't happen without significantly changing the way people live their lives.
It is a fact that the United States is largely, it's by far, the greatest contributor to world pollution and to global warming. So it's also expected it will take a greater share of the burden. It has been an industrial country for more than a century now, so it has a greater responsibility on the global warming that is already there than a country that's beginning industrialization now.
What Brazil and many developing countries suggested was this: that because wealthy countries like the United States create the most pollution, they should provide technology and money to deal with global warming. However, this kind of assistance often comes with a double standard. The United States' position on the Brazilian rainforest is an example.
I think the United States should be mainly occupied with deforestation in its own territory. Of course, we have a preoccupation with our rainforest. Today there is a clear view that we have projects of sustainable development which tap the resources of the forest without destroying it. What we don't like is the fact that if the US or any other country for that matter has a particular law, which is an internal law, and wants to apply it extraterritorially, I mean, that goes against our basic principles in terms of international and constitutional law. There are means being studied, including joint programs, I mean, investments with private and public capital in developing countries so that richer countries can help also the developing countries to have a cleaner pattern of development without creating straitjackets that would be very detrimental to our welfare, because you have to always think that poverty is the worst polluter.
Those of us who work in human rights hope that as many governments as possible will have principled positions on human rights without thinking of particular financial interests. However, living in the world that we live, we know for sure that this cannot always be the case.
President Jiang Zemin got full military honors on his arrival in Hawaii. In a sense, Jiang brought more than 1 billion Chinese along for the ride. In the eyes of American businessmen and politicians, 1 billion Chinese represent a huge and largely untapped market for U.S.-made products.
In April of 1997, one of the United States' largest exporters, Boeing, was vying for billions of dollars in contracts with China. But politics appeared to be getting in the way. The United States was threatening to withhold trade privileges from China because of its poor human rights record. And the U.S. had already angered China by voting for the United Nations Human Rights Resolution condemning the Asian giant.
China certainly is a country that is in need of attention from the standpoint of human rights in terms of treatment of ethnic minorities, democracy, the ability of labor to organize. So we have an interest in our foreign policy to do that. At the same time, we have an interest in economic security for our own people, and that it means greater world trade, particularly selling in a market like China that is growing so rapidly, and we have to balance those two interests.
While the United States government kept up the pressure, China awarded Boeing's chief competitor, Airbus of France, with a $1.5 billion contract. The deal was announced just 1 month after France voted against the UN resolution to censure China's human rights record. With more contracts still in the balance, Boeing worked to turn the tide. It enlisted other Fortune 500 companies and lobbied Congress and the administration not to impose trade sanctions on China.
They have set up public relations campaigns. They have funded organizations to promote better understanding of China. They have promoted exchange visits. I mean, on the one hand, they agree with the vast majority of Americans that human rights should be better in China and that they would work in their own capacity to improve that. On the other hand, they want the freest hand possible to pursue their business interests without interruptions from government. And many of the multinationals operating in the United States today are saying, can't we have some sort of agreed upon policy that would permit us to pursue aggressive trade and investment policies with China with no fear that they'll be changed in the future?
Some 7 months after Boeing lost the contract to Airbus, Chinese President Jiang Zemin visited Washington. In a ceremony at the U.S. Commerce Department, Chinese leaders signed an even bigger contract with Boeing, a $3 billion deal for 50 new jetliners.
They don't talk about human rights at all. Indeed, I think this visit of President Jiang is basically a show for him, a political show.
The Chinese didn't apologize for human rights conditions, and the Clinton administration continued to be openly critical. The question remained, was it better to isolate China because of human rights abuses, or to engage China positively in the hope of influencing improvements in human rights? Increasingly, engagement is the preferred path.
You see certain leaders coming out of China actually recommending that. Leaders in the opposition, you might say. One such leader is the Dalai Lama, who is on record as saying that it's important for the United States to engage China, not to impose sanctions, not to isolate China, but to bring them to the bargaining table because they respond to connectivity. The Chinese leaders want to be engaged, they want to be part of the world economy and the world political system, and to push them into a corner would be a big mistake.
Someone said to me the other day, does starvation exist if CNN is not there to record it? Or is a war happening if the media is not there with cameras?
The international political agenda today is to a great extent determined by the media. And CNN's ability to get to any crisis right away and to focus the U.S. and global attention on that crisis certainly increases the chance that the world will respond to it.
This is unfortunate in a way because it tilts the attention of the world. It skewers it. For instance, there was enormous attention on Bosnia.
For 8,000 GIs in Bosnia, the only jobs left are the hard ones.
But at the same time, there were terrible things happening in Afghanistan. But no one gave any attention to Afghanistan.
The impact that television has is a function of whether or not the government of the day, Congress, the administration, know what they're doing. If you have leadership, then you don't have a vacuum. If you have a vacuum, then you have a very strong CNN effect.
As the media watches, U.S. policymakers calculate global consequences of their actions. Increasingly, the role of the United States in global politics is carried out with the help of international organizations and heavily influenced by multinational corporations.
The world has changed. It's no longer a bipolar world. It's no longer the Russians versus us or NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The challenges that America faces are now transnational. They're multilateral.
These are issues that cross borders, where one country alone cannot possibly succeed, where it is the best possible means of sharing the burden, of sharing the responsibility and the risk and the cost and the benefits by working together with and through UN in a constructive and positive way.
It is far better for the United States to act under the umbrella of the UN Security Council than it is to act alone. It not only gives us added support by other nations that would participate in such operations, but it gives us enhanced legitimacy in the particular country.
The UN is a forum for consensus building on very important issues. I mean, the UN has an indispensable role, and I think if the UN didn't exist, it would have to be invented.